Not all who served in Vietnam made it back, not because they died in battle, but because they were never seen again. American troops captured by the Vietcong often suffered far worse than death on the battlefield. Torture, isolation, and execution became part of their final days. And what happened to them was kept quiet, hidden in the shadows of a war full of secrets. It often started the same way: quiet footsteps on a jungle trail, then suddenly, chaos. A mine would go off, or bullets would tear through the trees. In that confusion, the Vietcong moved fast. They didn't just want to kill, they wanted prisoners, and they knew exactly how to get them. One of the earliest and most chilling examples happened in November 1965. Deep in the central highlands of South Vietnam, a squad from the 1st Cavalry Division was doing a routine patrol near Plei Mai. They had no idea they were walking straight into a trap. The ambush was quick. Explosions from claymore mines knocked several men down. Then gunfire rained from above. When it was over, 5 American soldiers had vanished into the trees. Locals later said the Vietcong had dragged them off into the jungle, barefoot, wounded, hands tied tightly behind their backs. The soldiers were taken alive, but it wouldn't stay that way for long. One of them was 19-year-old Private First Class Charles Long from Ohio. He had joined the Army just 6 months earlier. His letters home said he missed his dog, and he hoped to be back before Christmas. But he never returned. U.S. forces searched the area for days. Helicopters scanned the hills, infantry units swept the nearby villages. 2 weeks later, they found a shallow grave. Inside were 3 American bodies, badly decomposed, showing signs of execution. There was no sign of Charles Long or another missing soldier, Specialist Dan Rivers. Both were listed as missing in action. Their families waited years for news. They never got it. This wasn't just one terrible event. As the war spread across Vietnam, from Quang Tri in the north to the Mekong Delta in the south, more patrols went missing. Entire teams disappeared without a trace. Ambushes became more common, especially on jungle roads and isolated villages where U.S. troops were vulnerable. And whenever someone was taken alive, the outcome was rarely good. By late 1966, military records showed a rising number of American soldiers captured during these hit-and-run attacks. Some were part of recon missions. Others were medics, radio operators, or support personnel. The Vietcong didn't care. Anyone they could grab was valuable, either for intelligence or as a message. What made it worse was the terrain. The thick jungle, endless river systems, and hidden tunnels made escape nearly impossible. Captured soldiers were moved quickly, often blindfolded, to avoid being tracked. Sometimes villagers would whisper about a white soldier seen in a nearby camp. But by the time U.S. forces arrived, the camp would be gone, burnt to the ground, leaving only ash and scraps of American uniforms. And this was only the beginning. The more the U.S. pushed into Vietcong territory, the deeper they fell into an invisible trap. One of the most brutal examples happened in May 1966 during Operation Paul Revere near the Cambodian border in Pleiku province. The U.S. Army was trying to stop Vietcong units from sneaking across the border and attacking bases. During one firefight, several American soldiers were taken alive. One of them was Staff Sergeant David Huxley, a 28-year-old from Nebraska who had already served one tour in Korea. For weeks, nobody knew what happened to him. Then, during a sweep of the area near the Chupong Massif, his body was found in a shallow pit. His hands were tied tightly behind his back. His uniform was stripped off. His body showed clear signs of torture. He had been executed. Not quickly, not quietly. Many of the captured soldiers weren't even taken to real prisons. They were kept in pits dug into the earth, covered with sticks and leaves. Others were held in tiny underground cells, more like animal cages than rooms. There was barely enough space to sit, let alone stand. These jungle prisons were makeshift but effective. Hidden by the trees and protected by miles of thick forest, they were nearly impossible for U.S. forces to find. Even if rescue missions were launched, the prisoners were often moved before the helicopters ever arrived. One survivor, Corporal Alan Griggs, who managed to escape in 1967, later told his debriefers that the camps were always moving. Griggs was one of the very few lucky ones. Most never made it out. What made things worse was the lack of contact. Families back home were left in the dark. Sometimes they were told their loved ones were MIA. Other times, there was nothing. No letter, no phone call, just silence. Months passed, then years, and the jungle kept swallowing more names. Inside these hidden camps, the torture methods were often designed to break the body and the spirit. Some prisoners were starved, others were hung by their arms for hours. Some were forced to march through the rivers while sick with fever or infections. And when someone tried to escape and was caught, they were made an example of in front of the others. It wasn't just physical punishment either. The Viet Cong used mental games too. Sometimes they told prisoners the war was already lost, that their families had forgotten about them, that no one was coming to help. What made it even harder was that the Geneva Convention rules didn't apply here. These weren't official POW camps run by a government. These were field prisons controlled by guerrilla fighters who didn't follow international laws. That meant no Red Cross visits, no aid packages, no medical care. If you were sick, you stayed sick. If you were wounded, you bled. But sometimes through all of this, there was hope. In early 1967, during a routine resupply flight near Quang Ngai province, a U.S. Army helicopter was hit by ground fire and crash-landed into a thick patch of jungle. The crew, 5 men in total, survived the crash, but within hours they were surrounded by Viet Cong fighters. Now, the Viet Cong didn't kill them right away. Instead, they took the survivors captive and disappeared into the jungle. The prisoners were marched through thick forests, mostly at night. Their hands were tied, they were given almost no food, and their wounds from the crash were left untreated. One of the men, Specialist Alan Reed, was younger than most, at 20 years old, from Illinois. On the 5th night, during a moment when the guards let their guard down, Reed made a run for it. It was pitch black. He didn't know which way to go, but he ran as fast as he could, using the stars above to guide him. It took him 2 full days to reach friendly forces. He was weak, dehydrated, and covered in cuts from the jungle, but he made it. And when he finally spoke to Army officials, what he said alarmed everybody. Reed explained that the Viet Cong guards had made it very clear that if American forces came too close, the prisoners would be killed immediately. No negotiation. It was just part of their strategy. They didn't want camps to be found. They didn't want prisoners to be rescued. And they didn't want the U.S. to collect any proof of what happened in those jungles. This tactic wasn't unique to Quang Ngai. It was happening in other provinces too. In Kontum, Phu Yen, and even further south near the Mekong Delta, similar stories emerged. Camps destroyed, bodies were found tied up and buried. By the middle of the war, U.S. forces had learned that some areas of Vietnam were almost impossible to survive. One of the most feared of these regions was the Iron Triangle, located just northwest of Saigon. From the outside, the Iron Triangle looked like any other stretch of jungle, but underneath it was a maze of hidden bunkers, booby traps, and heavily armed Viet Cong units. For years, the area had been a stronghold for communist fighters, and they knew every inch of the terrain better than anybody. In May 1968, a 5-man reconnaissance team from the 25th Infantry Division was sent into the region to gather intelligence. The mission was supposed to only last a day, but after the team moved in, there was nothing. No radio, no flares, no backup request. They'd vanished. For weeks, U.S. and South Vietnamese forces searched the area, but the jungle, of course, made everything more difficult. It wasn't until 3 months later that answers finally started to emerge. A South Vietnamese patrol discovered what looked like an abandoned Viet Cong camp hidden deep under thick jungle cover. It was dug into the ground with branches and leaves carefully placed to hide the entrance. Inside, the smell of death was strong. They found the remains of 3 American soldiers in different parts of the camp. Their uniforms removed, their weapons were gone. And most chillingly, their dog tags had been collected and placed on a small altar, along with burned incense and strange carvings. The bodies showed signs of slow, deliberate violence. One had a broken leg that had never been treated. Another had bruises around his wrists and ankles, likely from being tied up for days. Based on the decomposition and condition of the remains, investigators believed they had not been killed all at once, but executed weeks apart. Now, this detail shocked everyone. The Viet Cong had likely held these men alive, maybe even in the same camp, and killed them, one by one, on their own schedule, for their own reasons. The other 2 of the men from the missing recon team were never recovered. This wasn't the only time something like this happened in the Iron Triangle. In September 1969, another squad lost 2 men to a sudden ambush. One was killed in the firefight. The other, a private, James Morrow, was captured. Days later, his body was found tied to a tree near a dirt road used by U.S. patrols. He had been shot in the head. Even in captivity, some soldiers tried to fight back. But in the jungles of Vietnam, resistance often came at a brutal price. In October 1963, just as U.S. involvement in the war was starting to grow, 3 American soldiers were captured near the Mekong Delta. Lieutenant Nick Rowe, Captain Rocky Versace, and Sergeant Dan Pitzer were on an advisory mission with South Vietnamese forces when their unit was ambushed by Viet Cong fighters. Most of the South Vietnamese soldiers were killed on the spot. The Americans were taken alive. They were dragged deep into the jungle, away from any chance of rescue. The Viet Cong held them in tiny bamboo cages, usually separated from one another, and began a long campaign to break their spirit. But Captain Versace stood out to them. Even though he was injured, he kept trying to escape. Once, he managed to slip away for a short time before being recaptured. Another time, he resisted so fiercely that the guards began isolating him completely. The Viet Cong didn't take defiance lightly. After 2 years of captivity, in September 1965, they executed Versace. His body was never recovered. But his resistance made an impact. Years later, the U.S. government awarded him the Medal of Honor, one of the few ever given to a prisoner of war. Sergeant Dan Pitzer survived. He was kept in jungle camps for 4 years. He developed malaria more than once, suffered from extreme weight loss, and lost nearly all his teeth due to infection. But he lived, and in 1967 he was released in a prisoner exchange. Lieutenant Nick Rowe would go on to become one of the war's most remarkable escape stories. After 5 years in captivity, he managed to escape in December 1968 during a patrol movement. It happened when a U.S. helicopter unexpectedly appeared overhead. In the confusion, Rowe overpowered a guard and ran into the jungle. He was rescued by U.S. forces hours later. Rowe would later use his experience to help train American soldiers on how to survive captivity and resist enemy pressure. He even wrote a book about it, named 5 Years to Freedom. But not everyone had Rowe's strength, and not everyone had a chance to resist. For many, the moment they fought back was the moment they signed their own death warrant. In another case from 1970, 2 American pilots, Captain Richard Strand and First Lieutenant Gary Morgan, were captured after their plane was shot down near the Laotian border. When they refused to cooperate, one was reportedly forced to dig his own grave. Local villagers said they heard gunshots in the jungle that night. Only one body was recovered. The other was never found. Not all executions happened in secret. Sometimes prisoners were used in propaganda, where they were forced to make anti-American statements or pose for photographs. In 1969, Corporal James Thomas was captured near Pleiku. Days later, photos surfaced showing him holding a sign criticizing the war. But what the public didn't know was that those images were taken under the threat of execution. Thomas was later killed in the jungle, just miles from the border. The Viet Cong never intended to let him live. They just wanted the message to spread first. And this wasn't unique. Specialist Michael Harris and Sergeant William Patton met the same fate. Forced to make recordings for North Vietnamese radio, then quietly executed and buried in unmarked graves. As the war dragged on into the 1970s, the fight spilled across borders, especially Cambodia, where the Viet Cong had quietly built hidden trails, camps, and supply depots. This border zone, thick with jungle and nearly impossible to monitor, became a major lifeline for the enemy. And that meant American forces had to follow. Officially, U.S. troops weren't supposed to be operating in Cambodia. But unofficially, MACVSOG, a secretive group made up of special forces and other elite soldiers, were already deep inside. Their missions were classified. They wore no identifying patches, and if they were caught, there'd be no official rescue. In early 1972, one of these teams of 6 men crossed into Cambodian territory to disrupt a supply route near the Sihanouk Trail. At first, everything went to plan. They moved through the jungle quietly, set charges, and gathered intelligence. But on the way back, something went wrong. A group of North Vietnamese regulars, working with the Viet Cong, spotted their trail. The team was ambushed, and despite returning fire, only 2 were believed to have escaped. The other 2 were captured. Radio signals stopped. Extraction teams searched, but the jungle was thick, and the area was crawling with enemy fighters. Days turned into weeks. What happened next was pieced together only years later. Former Viet Cong fighters later admitted that they were kept alive at first, mainly as leverage. But when U.S. aircraft began flying low over the region looking for them, captors panicked. The prisoners were taken to a remote site near the Chup plantation, where they were reportedly lined up and shot. The camp was then abandoned. Months later, in late 1972, a Cambodian farmer discovered something strange in the soil. A set of boots sticking out from underneath a thin layer of earth. Local authorities notified South Vietnamese forces, and with help from American advisors, the site was uncovered. 4 bodies, hands still tied, blindfolds still on. It took weeks to confirm the identities. The remains were those of the missing team. For years, their mission remained classified. Official reports didn't list them as killed in Cambodia. In fact, for a while, they weren't listed at all. But stories started to leak. It wasn't until the 1990s that their names were finally added to some of the formal lists of American dead. By 1973, the war was nearly over. The U.S. was pulling out, peace talks were underway, but the violence didn't stop. Just before the Paris Peace Accords were signed, 2 American soldiers, Kevin Darnell and Larry Green, were captured in Quang Tri province. The ceasefire came, but the Viet Cong didn't release them. Instead, on February 5, 1973, they were executed in the jungle. Their bodies were found in a crater, shot, and left without ceremony. In total, over 58,000 Americans died in Vietnam. Some died in battle, others in prison camps. Some were never found at all.